Thank you so much, Auntie Sylvia. Very, very grateful. And to every one of you that's watching, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the words of encouragement, Clinton, as Dr. Clinton Kadochi, and many others who come on these calls every morning. Thank you for those of you on Facebook. We see you. And so today we are beginning a whole new series around leadership. And let me begin by, and it'll be quite a series as well. Now, let me begin by highlighting that the most common excuse given for why Africa is poor, the most common excuse given is leadership. This is what most people tend to say. They say, Africa is poor because the leadership is bad. And well, yes, it does play a big role, because obvious is not the major reason Africa is poor. I have my own reasons, but that's not the presentation today. But it definitely does play a big role. And what is interesting is that there is a quote, a very well-known quote from one of the greatest leadership trainers in the world, somebody who's been teaching on leadership for a long time. That's Dr. John Maxwell. Maxwell says, and I quote, "Everything rises and falls on leadership." So yes, in essence, whenever you see any organization, any institution, any society, any country, and you see chaos in that country, you see failed systems, you see failed institutions, essentially the problem lies with leadership. So yes, it is very true. And so in many instances, Africa has leadership as one of its major tenets to blame for where it is today. Now, having said all that, there's so much more when it comes to Africa, but you have to realize that this actually applies at a very basic level. So we're coming right into the most basic level, which is you and I. And each one of us brings leadership into whatever we do. And really, to kind of wrap this all up, you have to realize that it is your leadership. It is your ability to first be a great leader of yourself, and then to be a leader of those to whom you have been tasked to lead. That is the only way you're going to bring out the best in everything. And so what I want to do is I want to take you through a very, very deep journey around this. Now, in many years of training and helping many realize their potential and grow to become the very best versions of themselves, the statement, "everything rises and falls on leadership," has proven truer daily. Whether it's an organization, a church, or government, the ability to harness greatness and achieve a great culture and good governance is directly linked to its leadership. So in fact, in many instances, the saying is, every organization carries the DNA of its leadership, okay? So it therefore stands to reason that one cannot speak of great results without acknowledging great leadership. And it is indeed leadership that inevitably determines both good governance and strong ethics, as well as a positive organizational and work culture. Where such great leadership is missing, the results are what we now see in many African countries, and of course in many organizations and in many homes as well. And so then, what makes good leadership? And what are good leadership principles? That's what we'll be studying over these next couple of weeks. Now, these are the questions that the remaining training, which we'll be running, is aiming to tackle. And the aim is to show that whether it's an individual, whether it's a church, organization, country, the whole continent of Africa, we need good leaders as much as we do strong institutions and good governance. But the irony is that those two do not show up without first having a visionary to make them happen. So in other words, the leaders are what give birth to the strong institutions and good governance. Now, these three kind of all go together, but what is even truer is that for the other two to take off, like I say, they must commence with good leadership. So for me, they are what I would term the kinks that must be straightened out. The leadership is the major kink, and then these two kind of work themselves out. So what really is leadership, and what are good principles? So let's start from there. So to do the subject some justice, let me begin by first dealing with what it is not. So I'm going to deal with misconceptions. I want to deal with misconstruations, okay? But for the sake of those that really have to know, the Oxford English Dictionary defines leadership as an action of leading a group of people or an organization, that being a noun, the state or position of being a leader and the leaders of an organization, country, institution, or corporation, church, association, and so on and so forth. And Forbes defines it as a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards achievement of a goal. So there's always a goal, and there's always people, and there's always a cause. Okay, so good leaders bring these three together and make them happen, leading to the achievement of the goal. That's what a leader is. So then leadership demands a certain very clear thing from the onset, which if that's missing, will inevitably compromise the outcome. Okay, so these things include a clear vision, a well-understood mission, and a clearly presented goal. So then, great leaders and are super clear about what they would like to see and communicate, and they do this very clearly to those around them. So I'll be delving into that aspect soon enough. Okay, but let's kind of deal with what leadership is not. And the misconception I shall be looking at stem from a collective thinking based on a skewed view of what people think leadership is, which unfortunately persists even today. Okay. And you see, the earliest known collective works around leadership concepts and thoughts are gleaned historically from, of course, the Greeks, and specifically their thinkers of that day. Okay, and such included but was not limited to people like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and many others. And these were famous philosophers who greatly shaped history and all subsequent civilizations after them. So their thinking has indeed affected all areas of human endeavor, including religion. And as such, it has shaped the way ethics and morality around leadership was not only viewed, but espoused as well. Now, this thinking went on to affect Roman thinking as well. And this can be seen in every Greek mythology. Most mythical gods and beings like Zeus and what have you got their equivalent Roman treatise. So this is where you see that the Greek culture and thinking went on to affect the Roman culture and thinking, and we know very well that the Roman culture and thinking had a massive impact on European thinking and culture, and that kind of ran right all the way through to where we are today, because we are basically upgraded Rome, okay, Rome 2.0, and it's not us as Africans, I'm talking about the civilized world as we know it. And the whole concept of what Rome is, remember the leading language of Rome was Latin. And to this day, science and all its major roots are in Latin. Language is rooted in Latin. And I'm speaking specifically English, which is a very powerful language used all over the world for the purposes of communication. All the other languages have all that root. It all roots back into Latin, especially when you look at the scientific and progressive Renaissance era kind of thinking. And leadership draws its roots from there, whether we like it or not. So here are 4 misconceptions, which we'll now look at for the remaining 16 minutes. The first one, leadership is a product of natural endowment. That was the first belief. Okay. Second, leadership is a product of birth traits. Very interesting. Thirdly, leadership is a product of providence. So there's this group that believes that someone is destined to lead, and that's how they end up leading. And then the fourth one is leadership is a product of charismatic personality. So these 4 very interesting stands are what, for a number of people, determine their view on what they thought leadership is. Now, these thoughts are very, very wrong. But you know what? Let's begin to break them down. So let's begin with the first one. Leadership is a product of natural endowment. And I'm going to show you how these views actually shape us to this day, and how they actually shaped and created a way of thinking that has affected so many aspects of human endeavor. Okay, so let's begin with the first one. So number 1, based on this viewpoint, that is where you get the idea that leaders are born. Okay, so leadership is a product of natural endowment. You're born a leader. This is the viewpoint. And because of this view, it was believed that leaders had to have a naturally endowed ability rather than a learned one. So that older crew really believed that somehow leaders were actually born that way, and you had to have this certain look. Now listen to this. So this meant that they had to have naturally bigger sizes. They were like bigger, more built, taller, wider. They had to have certain natural features. This included the thin lips, the sharp nose. And by the way, I'm not making this up. You can actually go check it out, okay? The sharp nose, not flat. The long face, not round. And I'll show you just now. The square jaw, not small. Fair-skinned, not dark-skinned. And an ability to fare well in armed combat. So 6 qualities. And you will be amazed when I begin to break it down. You will see that this was the reasoning behind even nobility. So people who were seen as nobles or blue bloods had to have this kind of features. So they were very particular about what a leader looks like. And we know that this was the reasoning, for example, behind racism. This was the reasoning behind why certain types of tribes or certain types of people were considered rulers over other types of people. It was all based around the looks, and it really reared its ugly head during the time of colonialism, and just before colonialism, slavery. The people with for example, with the longer faces were opted or picked as leaders compared to the ones. Let me give you a very practical example in Africa, which is extremely painful, but it's history. When the Belgians went into Rwanda and Burundi, true story, in the early days, what did they do? They actually began to separate this one group of people. I think they were called Twas, if I'm not wrong. They were all just one group of people. Same people, same genus, same language, same area, same background, same people. What the Belgians did is when they went there, they said, no. These ones, meaning the ones who had the thinner noses or the narrower noses, okay? The ones who had the thinner lips, the ones who had the longer faces, they called them the more elite. So they said they have Ethiopic background, and they called them Tutsi. And then these round, flat, thick-lipped guys, these are Hutus. These are more African. These are more brutish. I'm not going to go into the background of where that all comes from. I'm just giving you an example. So what they did is they began to put the Tutsis in charge of the Hutus. They gave the Tutsis better education, better schools, better hospitals, and better jobs. So they took them into white-collar jobs and gave them more prominent and more supervisory roles, whereas the Hutus were kept for more manual labor and more, mundane tasks. So they basically did the office orderly stuff. They did the runaround. They did the hard work. So this went on for the entire period of colonization till the 60s, when Rwanda became free. But it was very, very interesting, because at that time, there were lesser Hutus, obviously, because they were measuring them and deciding who's a Hutu and who's a Tutsi. And then these Hutus were in the majority, and so began a resentment. This resentment actually comes right from the early days of the separation by these white Belgians. So they caused that because they used these look better, so these are therefore more in leadership. They actually gauge them also by tone of their skin. So this is the same story. Go all over Africa, look at the way they picked leaders in terms of who became a leader where. And you will see that we're using this same strategy. They will look at features. They will look at the looks of an individual. They'll look at the natural endowments. And they decided these are more leadership qualities. These, they look funny. They are less leaders. That has caused major problems in the world. And you and I both know this was such a lame, useless way of picking people, because there are so many people who've gone on to be great leaders, and their looks, stature, size have absolutely nothing to do with it. Skin tone, nothing to do with it. But this was a method that was used, and it was, for the longest of times, endorsed as a method of determining leadership. So it's a very unfortunate thing. Very big misconception. Number two, leadership is a product of birth traits. I guess that's kind of like a continuation of the first one. Now, this is the idea where the idea of bloodlines comes in. Now, this insistence that royalty automatically meant one is of noble blood and thus must be a leader draws its reasoning from this. So then, if one is not born of nobility, they cannot ever lead. And you can imagine the times when it was clear that the leaders like kings had a few marbles missing in their heads, yet because of this absurd position had to be treated as kings and even handled very serious decisions as monarchs. History is replete with such examples. And one king that certainly comes to mind is the English monarch, King George III, who exhibited such mental illness, but still ruled despite these obvious signs. And interestingly, there is a relatively long list of such monarchs who still ruled in spite of their obvious mental conditions. And bear in mind, too, that leadership was seen as God's will. So even if these leaders exhibited obvious signs of mental illness, this paradigm stood strong and prevailed even where common sense dictated otherwise. That's a great example. And you know, in many countries, in many places, this is one of the biggest challenges as well. So this idea that as long as somebody is born in a particular line of rulers or a particular family or a particular group or social strata, they therefore make a better leader, that is a terrible way of looking at things. And it's only because we learned better that as a people we have moved on. We still have a lot of royalty, and frankly, some of it leaves much to be desired. But nonetheless, the smarter, more wizened individuals realize that the birth traits thing is just as lame as the physical features, okay? So number three, leadership is a product of providence. This one is where there's a lot of mental dealings to do with. There's this group that believes that people are destined to lead. Now, in a way, I suppose if one looks at scripture, you could say, yeah, kind of true, but let me just teach this first. Now here we have a very interesting view that leadership is God ordained, okay? The feeling is that if a leader rules or is in a process of doing so, this is a mark or sign it has been the will of God. Okay, if you have followed the series I've been teaching for many, many years, you know I debunk that seriously. But that does not change the fact that many politicians and religious leaders especially love to use this as a subterfuge. Subterfuge is a fancy word for excuse to showcase their being God's anointed, a term that works very well with the gullible, okay, the sheeple, and there are many gullible people. So we know for a fact that whilst there may be some truth on the idea of destiny bringing about some individuals into power, I agree totally. I've seen it throughout Zambia's own history. It does not in any way mean that they are God's choice at all, as can be evidenced historically by some leaders in the past who were viewed to be such, only for their rule to be characterized by monumental failure on many levels. So man chooses who he wants. Best example is in the book of Kings, well, Samuel, if you like, because at that stage, Israel was tired of being a theocracy. A theocracy is a country ruled by God through his chosen judges. And they hated that because they admired the idea of kings like their neighbors had. So they protested bitterly. They said, we don't want this thing of judges and prophets ruling us. We want kings. We want a king like our neighbors. And they made so much noise about it. Samuel was extremely touched about it, but God told him, don't worry, they are not rejecting you, they are rejecting me as God. Give them what they want. And the Bible teaches us that that's exactly what happened. God then handed them over and said, who do you want? And democracy, that interesting concept that I'll tackle sometime in the future, chose the majority, the mob chose Saul. And you know what they picked Saul for? Exactly the traits I'm telling you about. He was physically imposing stature. He was head and shoulders above the rest of Israel. So he had that build. He had the the charisma as an individual. People liked him. He commanded a lot of respect as an individual, and everything about Saul just suited what they were looking for. So they wanted him, but we know God did not want him, but they called him God's anointed, and he ruled as God's anointed. We know very well that even though he ruled as God's anointed, he made major mistakes, major issues that costed not just himself, but it actually affected his whole family for generations ahead. In fact, to such an extent that God even ripped the kingdom away from his hand because he made such a terrible leader. He made terrible decisions on behalf of Israel. And that's what I want all of you to understand as you watch this, that the concept and idea of being God's anointed and this divine destiny thing is a questionable trait, at least, and it cannot be used as a concept to determine leadership. Leadership goes way beyond someone being naturally endowed, someone having the physical traits, someone being destined to lead. All these are misconceptions, and they have led our countries, our peoples down very bad paths because of emotions. So you got to understand that those traits don't match. And the last one real quick, leadership is a product of charismatic personality. Couldn't be worse. This is the worst one. This is a great fallacy. Whilst it's true that many great leaders tend to be great communicators, that's true. It doesn't always mean that if one does not possess charisma and personal magnetism, they can't make good or even great leaders. And you know, one of my favorite characters we can think of is Moses in the Bible. We are taught that he could hardly speak. In fact, he stammered. He even had Aaron speak on his behalf, and so did his sister Miriam, yet his leadership is completely unquestionable rather. Here's what the Bible had to say about this man who stuttered, this man who stammered, this man who couldn't speak, this man who most times was very quiet, never said anything. That's how interestingly amazing Moses was. He hardly spoke. All the time it was his spokesperson, Aaron, who spoke on his behalf. But listen to what God said about Moses. But since then, there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Wow, that's a guy who stammered. That's a guy who was always quiet, never said much. In fact, he was so quiet at one point, his brother and sister kungad him. That's a word for like picked on him and began to speak against him and said a lot of scathing accusations, especially in relation to his wife. And God literally stood up and spoke on his behalf. He said, "You two, who the heck are you?" I'm paraphrasing, "to be speaking against this man, Moses? You, I speak to you in visions and dreams. Him, I speak face to face as I do to a friend. How dare you do that?" So he literally stood up and faced two people opposing him because of his humility and quietness. Moses was a very quiet guy. Literally, by the time he was becoming this great prophet at 80, he was a very quiet and laid back person. But the power that Moses moved with, do you know that Miriam was struck with leprosy on the spot for speaking against Moses? So that's the level of power and authority this man moved with. You know, he had so much authority and aura about him. The Bible tells us that when Moses would go to meet God, the whole Israel would stand up and watch him. And he'd walk across to the tabernacle, and the fire, the cloud by day would settle in there, and then Moses walks in. I mean, this man would face God. He was so fearsome. Most times he had to wear a veil over his face, because when he went to the mountain and came back, his face was so holy and it was just so amazing. It was shone so brightly. Everybody ran away from him in fear. Now, you can say, yeah, well, he had all these supernatural abilities. No, but the point is, the leadership of Moses demonstrates that you don't have to be charismatic to command profound effect. You don't have to be a great speaker to command great effect, but he was a communicator. And so we see that these 4 myths, I now close, we see that these 4 myths are absolutely untrue. So once again, leadership is a product of natural endowment, not true. Leadership is a product of birth traits, absolutely heck not true. Leadership is a product of providence, destined to lead. It's a 50-50 scenario, but it is definitely a misconception. And leadership is a product of charismatic personality, heck no. And let me close by using a very funny example. Today, all of you know Elon Musk, right? Yeah, you probably know Elon Musk. If you don't know Elon Musk, then kaya chape. But he is like the richest man in the world right now, and he's all over the place. He's in the news. He's on movies. A lot of people talk and reference him all over the place. SpaceX is program taking this ship thing into space and bring it back. I mean, all these are huge things. So he's very well known. Tesla, renewable energy. I mean, who doesn't know Elon Musk? So he's a very well known guy. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever listened to Elon Musk speak? I would like you to get go when we're done with this video. Just type and listen to one of his speeches. You would actually be like, who is this guy? So the only reason that you even listen to him is because this is the richest man, the most powerful, worth so much, and such an influence all over the place. But he hardly can speak. When he gives a speech, he does all the classic mistakes of public speaking. So he's not much to listen to. But what makes Elon Musk amazing is what he has done in his life. That's what is awe-inspiring for many individuals. So Elon Musk is an example of somebody that's not really charismatic, not really able to speak very well, even almost seems a bit off. When you listen to him many times, it sounds offish, but take it from me. He is a great leader because of what he's been able to demonstrate in his life. So this in itself should prove to you that yes, there are great leaders that are brilliant speakers like Obama and the rest of it, but there's also great leaders that can hardly put 2 words together. That does not define leadership. Your ability to speak well like me may not necessarily define leadership. It's great if you have it, but it's not a prerequisite. So today I've tackled very interesting components in relation to the misconceptions concerning leadership. And tomorrow, not tomorrow, next week, Monday, I want to tackle the 3 greatest misconceptions. So next week on Monday, I'm going to quote one of the great trainers on leadership, and I'm going to share 3 of the greatest misconceptions. So these are old standing traditional misconceptions, but the ones I'm going to tackle are modern misconceptions. And a lot of people actually operate using, engaging by these misconceptions. And no wonder they end up with great chaos in many organizations. So looking forward to have you. That's my little training for today. Remember, tomorrow Sylvia is on and we continue with our other program, same time, same credentials. Have a great day. God bless you and cheerio.